Hello and welcome to Roundtable. America's biggest economic enemy is China, and the US is desperate to stop Beijing cashing in at its expense. So where does Europe stand as Washington looks for support? Joe Biden's desire to distance China is not apparently echoed in all of Europe's capitals. The European Union is now Beijing's biggest trading partner, and it will be a difficult job to keep both sides happy. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Allegations of human rights abuses in China were notable at the recent G7 meeting for their absence. Apparently, to the United States, annoyance, and because of pressure from Europe. So while the EU has imposed some sanctions on China, what kind of long game is it planning? The Biden administration wants to rely on transatlantic alliances to counter growing global Chinese power. As he put it, to push back against the Chinese government's economic abuses and coercion. But no country does more business with the European Union than China. So many European nations are reluctant to antagonize that country's communist rulers. EU sanctions on China in March 2021 over human rights abuses triggered furious Chinese sanctions in response. In the most recent G7 meeting, the European Union blocked efforts to call out China for its use of forced labor in the Xinjiang region, much to American frustration. So will the EU ever sign up to Biden's plans to counter China? And can it stay on good terms with both of those global powers? My pleasure to welcome back to Roundtable Dr. Winnie King. She's in Bristol in the UK and is a policy analyst and specialist in the Chinese political economy. We cross to Washington, D.C. There we see Timothy Heath, Senior International Defence Researcher at the RAND Corporation. And in Brussels, Theresa Fallon, Founder and Director of the Centre for Russia-Europe Asia Studies. Great to have all three of you with us. Any one of you can comment on this, but I'm going to come to you, Theresa, first of all. Is this a very difficult situation for the European Union, or the perfect opportunity?
I think that it marks a new period of relations, transatlantic relations with Europe and the US. After 4 years of Trump, Europe was largely bruised. So I think the Biden administration has made it very clear with the G7 summit, the NATO summit, as well as the EU-China meeting, and then capped off with the diplomatic dance of the Putin-Biden summit, that things are moving, that he's revitalizing relations with the transatlantic partners. And I think that's what it's taking them a little while to get used to this idea. And in the meantime, they also have deep economic relations with China. So it's a bit of a dilemma for the Europeans. And so there are three areas I think that they really need to focus on. One is economic coercion. The US and Europe have a lot in common in regard to this narrative, because Xi Jinping is very clever about how to use economic coercion to prevent countries from doing anything that China is not happy about. For example, Germany is sending a ship to the South China Sea, which of course made the Americans happy, but the Chinese aren't happy about that. So they invited the ship to go to Shanghai for a port visit. And many analysts are concerned about this because this could actually be interpreted in a negative way. It could be perceived that Germany's actually asking Beijing for permission to sail in the South China Sea. So this idea of kind of trying to balance everybody, Germany largely leads on China policy in Europe because they are the biggest trade partner with China for the last 5 years. So I think Germany leads on this. We're coming to an end of an era with Angela Merkel leaving. She's been in power for 16 years, and the future is to be written on how the EU will perform.
We'll talk about what her predecessor and perhaps the Greens might do in Germany in a little while. Winnie, I'll come to you on China's position in just a moment. But Tim, when it comes to the new American administration, it's going to be difficult for them not to want to strong-arm the Europeans, but that could backfire.
Very good point. I agree that President Biden is eager to try to build a multilateral approach. He has said that regarding China, he thinks European allies are especially important. help present a united front in favor of democracy and human rights. However, I think that's going to be extremely challenging given the deep divisions in Europe and the lack of unity and lack of cohesion on how to deal with China. Beyond token gestures and statements, we just haven't seen a whole lot come out of the EU in a unified way regarding China.
When it comes to the position on China with regards to Europe, the EU is likely to turn around and say, well, hang on, this is our biggest trading partner. We need to make overtures to them. We cannot ostracize them entirely. And Biden, does he understand that?
He understands that, I think. I mean, everybody recognizes the importance of China as a trade partner. China's an important trade partner for the United States and for all of America's allies in Asia as well. So, I think President Biden has some realistic expectations and will have to have realistic expectations of what the Europeans will be willing to do. It may be the case that on certain issues, Europe will not act in unity, and the U.S. will have to work with its most closest allies, such as Britain, and accept that the rest of Europe will not be willing to go along. But in my opinion, that opens up some risks when the U.S. starts picking and choosing which European allies to work with and to ignore the rest.
Winnie, with you in just a moment, but we're going to hear from the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, and he's responding to the fact that the European Union and Parliament slapped sanctions on certain areas of the Chinese government and some trade sanctions as well. China retaliated with this, and these were the words he had to say in response. China-EU relations will not be derailed by one or two sanctions. I'm afraid the EU sanctions were not firmly grounded in realities. They were based on so-called evidence. But the EU never communicated with China what that evidence was. This is the interesting point. China is a trustworthy partner of all countries, not a systemic rival locked in confrontation. So there we have the Chinese Foreign Minister, Winnie, poo-pooing the sanctions, say they won't make much difference. But what evidence has he got that China can be trusted?
China's been quite consistent in terms of its foreign policy when it engages with the major powers that we're talking about in the form of the European Union and Great Britain and the United States. The key things that the Americans are concerned about are not actually areas where China's been particularly aggressive in terms of trying to challenge American dominance or Americans' positions. When it comes to issues that the European Union is concerned about, such as reciprocity, when it comes to trade and investment, these are things that are obviously negotiated. We have to remember that that China, according to WTO regulations, is still considered to be a developing economy. Now, we can challenge that line as to whether or not that remains the case, considering its size as the world's second largest economy and considering the size of trade deficits that major economies have with China. But these are things that need to be negotiated, and these are things that need to be reassessed. From China's perspective, the line of how it's responding to what the G7 summit came out with, what NATO has come out with, or what even America, Blinken, and the European Union individual member states are coming out with, it's been quite flexible, I think, in terms of how it's responded. So Theresa's point that comes out that, you know, the fact that the Germans are sending it's part of its military to the South China Sea, the fact that the Chinese respond with something like an invitation to Shanghai, the fact that Tim responds to say that European Union itself does not have a unified China policy, that its member states are quite divided in terms of how it wants to engage with China. China very much recognizes this. It is not reactive in its actions and its decisions. And a lot of the things that we talk about with regards to the sanctions is very much a very traditional diplomatic tit for tat. So a lot of what China's doing is not trying to rock the boat, per se, as the Americans are suggesting. We're very much falling in line with what the Americans, the Europeans have followed all along with regards to international policy.
Do feel free at any time if any one of you wants to say something in response to you've heard. Don't put your hand. Oh, you do, Theresa. Okay, carry on.
Okay, well, I would just like to say that before Biden came to office, the Chinese were really rapidly trying to negotiate this comprehensive agreement on investment, otherwise known as the KAI. And it had been sitting on the back burner for 7 years. So they had 35 meetings, and it only accelerated once Joe Biden was elected president. So, of course, the infamous tweet that Jake Sullivan sent out, please wait, we're coming into office, we want to work with our European partners.
But can I stop you there? Because this massive treaty, this investment treaty, has now been put on ice because of the sanctions that China's imposed upon the Europeans.
So that's my point. So China had it. They won. They got agreed in principle. But because they did this supersizing of sanctions, they did more than double. They actually, they managed to, grab defeat from the jaws of victory. So the idea that they could sanction members of the European Parliament, 5 of them, who actually had to ratify the agreement to get it passed, shows that either 1, they miscalculated, or 2, they really feel confident that they can do this, knowing that the governments want this deal so badly, and that now it's in the deep freeze. So I think China's miscalculation with Europe, we see the wolf warrior diplomacy, and they really...
well, what is wolf warrior diplomacy? Because I've got that written down as a note, and I wanted to ask somebody what it actually means. You carry on, Theresa, please.
Well, wolf warrior diplomacy is a term that the West or some Western wags have given to this kind of more assertive, more aggressive Chinese diplomacy. And I'll give you an example. For example, the Swedish ambassador, the Chinese ambassador to Sweden said, for our friends, we have wine. For our enemies, we have shotguns. And so it's far more aggressive. It's not this kind of nice diplomacy. It's very pushy and very hard. And for example, when the head of the China group inside the European Parliament was sanctioned, the next day in the Global Times, they were saying, yay, enemy number 1 was sanctioned. So they're kind of gloating about this ability to sanction. And so these kind of super sanctions that they're using now is causing tensions within relations with Europe. So Europe is trying to come up with another part of their toolbox.
It's sort of rather like an overreaction. Yeah, Tim, do say whatever you want to say, but I want to ask you about the military side of these things in just a moment.
Sure. The one thing I would say about Beijing's approach, wolf warrior diplomacy and some of the setbacks aside, I think Beijing knows it will not win over Europe as a close partner. The Europeans will generally trend towards the U.S. However, that's not Beijing's goal. What Beijing intends is to keep Europe divided and weakened, and therefore, even if they are a partner of the U.S., they cannot act in a unified manner, and they cannot really be of much help to the U.S. I think for Beijing, that is a goal that's feasible and that seems to be behind some of their latest developments.
But is it really divided? Winnie, sorry to stop you, but I want to bring this up from Angela Merkel. Is it really divided when we hear this sort of sentiment from the German Chancellor?
China is our rival in many questions, but also our partner in many aspects, which we made clear yesterday at the G7. And for me, it is very important that we keep offering political dialogues and discourse, much like we do with Russia, to try and find solutions. But where there is a threat, and these do exist in the hybrid area, then NATO needs to be prepared.
Tim, since your side of things is to do with defence as well, it's not just trade that's at issue here, it's also about military posturing.
Yes, so there are a lot of issues that the U.S. has with China, and Europe shares some of those concerns. You didn't talk about Huawei, but there's 5G, there's technology issues. There are the trade issues that you mentioned. But in terms of the military, the U.S. has allies in Asia, and the U.S. is obligated to help many of those allies if they're attacked by China. Europe has no such obligation. So Europe's view of China as a military threat is quite different from the U.S. I think you're right to read that quote. And again, I just want to emphasize there are gestures and helpful gestures and statements by the EU that suggest a level of solidarity. But on the really difficult issues, military issues, I think there's still quite a gap between the U.S. and European countries.
OK, Tim, thanks. Winnie, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Okay, so there's several things I wanted to point just really quickly to follow up for Tim's point. And the quote that Angela Merkel clip talked about is that Macron made it very clear that actually when it comes to NATO, that China actually should not be and is not the key target with regards to NATO concerns. It actually is on the periphery and should not be a priority. I think a key thing that we also need to talk about when it comes to the European Union and its position with regards to China is that when we have a post-Brexit European Union, there is a large United Kingdom-sized hole with regards to the its economic position. So these are certain things that, with regards to the trade agreement that the Chinese and the Europeans have, that foreign direct investment can come in to the European Union. China is Europe's largest trading partner with regards to imports. It is its third largest partner with regards to exports. And so there is clearly a position within which China is looked upon as a potential deeper partner. And we know that Angela Merkel is going to be stepping down. The new potential leader that is basically earmarked to take over. And I'm drawing a blank on his name right now.
Armin Laschet.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. But he is very much of the similar line where he says, you know what, we recognize that China, our relationship with China has a lot of things that we need to balance, but economic relations is certainly a strategic interest for the German.
But what if it is Laschet in partnership with others, or indeed the Greens that come in, which is still a possibility? How will that reset the relationship?
Well, from my position, particularly if it's the Greens, they have very clearly pointed out that climate change is a fundamental normative value within the European Union, and as a key partner with regards to collaboration on climate change, China and the European Union work very, very well together. Something that the European Union and America are still quite unstable about.
Okay.
So if we're trying to prioritize that, then we need to balance that kind of line as well.
Theresa, you didn't get your hand up fast enough. That was Tim.
Yes. No, I think that just underscores my point that the Chinese want to treat the Europeans as an equal partner with the U.S., and they would like to see the U.S. treat, and Europe actually treat U.S. and China as equal partners. The idea is to have U.S. and Europe acting as independent actors with very little coordination or minimal coordination. And the fact that Europe and U.S. do have different priorities and different concerns that they want to address with the Chinese suggests that seam is there, and the Chinese are working on expanding that seam.
Which leads me, Theresa, to the next point, and you can say whatever you want, of course, which is how much does I won't say divided Europe, but a Europe with different complexions when it comes to China, some that support the Belt and Road Initiative, some that want to say things about China's human rights abuses, what's happening in Hong Kong, some that don't. How much does that divided approach either benefit Europe when it comes to China or disadvantage it?
Well, one thing we have seen is a steep decline in public opinion on China. I mean, this happened before COVID-19, but it's plummeted since. And so in democracies, the governments have to kind of reflect on what the public is saying. So there is a major chasm between elite opinion and the public opinion. So I think it will be difficult for governments to manage this, staying very close with China, with elite capture, for example. Germany is a big trading partner, but if you look at the statistics, it's largely the car industry and the chemical industry. And so these companies have actually co-opted the rest of Europe in regard to China policy. I think the issues that happened in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, this has really galvanized the public, in addition to obfuscation on COVID-19. And we should remember that the biggest trading partner, if you include services, is the United States. The biggest investor in Europe is the United States. So Europe also needs to cooperate with the US in regard to technology transfer, because Europe is kind of helping the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, leapfrog dramatically. So US needs to cooperate with Europe. The Europeans have to get on board and not sell them the best technology that they have. And so I think that this is another area needed for cooperation. And in addition, the next government in Germany, if it is a CDU Green coalition, the Greens are traditionally very pro-transatlantic and very negative on China. So I think we would see a very different type of government than what we see now with Angela Merkel.
Winnie, when it comes to the reset after the UK left the European Union, did the bloc look to China perhaps to fill a little bit of a void?
I don't want to say that they look solely at China, but China definitely remained a primary partner in this. That's one of the reasons why the CIA became
Which is the investment thing we were talking about, yeah.
Yes, the Comprehensive Investment Agreement, why it became such an important aspect. I think it's a little bit I understand where Teresa's coming from in terms of saying that, that it was signed in December, Biden was elected in November, but these negotiations have went on for over 7 years. So it's not like everything was wrapped up just because Biden was elected, or we knew that Trump was going to lose.
But equally, the European Union cannot afford to get on the wrong side of China because, despite all the disparaging comments that have been made about the way it handled the pandemic, or perhaps with the origin of the virus, China has been growing, one of the few areas in the world that's seen economic growth in the last 18 months, and the EU wants to be party to that.
Definitely. In the way that the Chinese services sector is expanding, there's definitely a lot of capacity for foreign companies, and European companies in particular, which the Chinese have recognized, to allow for investment with regards to innovation, cutting edge, green tech. And all of these areas are areas that the Europeans are particularly advanced in.
Tim, is it going to take some very clever backroom dealing for the United States to keep both the European Union, well, indeed Europe as a whole, and China on board?
I think what it's going to take for the United States is a multifaceted approach. There will be some issues where the U.S. and Europeans agree and can cooperate closely, and we talked about some of those examples, certainly pointing out the systemic differences in values and some of the differences between the U.S. and China on tech standards. I think there's quite a bit of agreement among a lot of European countries, and there's fertile ground for making real progress.
So common ground, but where do they majorly differ?
So, yes, so there will be other issues where the U.S. and Europeans simply cannot come to an agreement, and the U.S. will have to make some tough decisions. Either the U.S. will have to accept that it will act alone, or it may be able to recruit a few European allies who really maybe share the same concerns. And in that case, the U.S. has a divided Europe approach where the U.S. recognizes the limits of its ability to build unity and simply acts with a smaller group of partners.
Theresa, you were itching to say something, I could see.
Well, I was thinking that this idea that Europe is divided, of course, the whole idea of Europe working together, if they can get a decent China strategy, I think they could work much more closely with the United States. And we should also recall that they initiated themselves the EU-US dialogue on China. So there seems to be some flailing about. They're trying to figure out which way to go. And I think the contours of the Biden administration's policy on China is becoming far more clear. He announced at the G7 this kind of democracies versus autocracies. And I think some of these decisions may be painful, and Europeans must have to take that on board. Will they adopt 5G, the Huawei? Many states have said no, but Germany is kind of waffling on that one. So I think that to keep Europe together, I think the Europeans themselves have to come up with
different strokes for different folks, and it is a union, but it is not a massive federation as yet. Winnie, sorry, you want to say something, and then we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah. So just really quickly, I think it's a very important point to highlight is the fact that while the G7 was seen as this kind of like beginning new chapter for Sino-EU relations, or even the G7 itself, a lot of the things that we talk about with regards to what Biden is suggesting, for instance, the building back the better world, the infrastructure plan that they're adopting to challenge the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the Japanese, the Europeans and the Indians, and the Europeans and ASEAN have actually, from 2019 onwards, promoted large strategic infrastructure investments to try and promote and challenge China's sole BRI kind of initiative.
So since we've only got a minute and a half or thereabouts, do you think massively closer cooperation between the EU and the European and China can be achieved at the same time as the EU keeping the United States sweet? And will it happen soon? Will we get this investment package through by the end of this year or next year?
There's potential. That's the furthest I can go because of what's happening on the military side.
So it's a possibility. I'm going to run through all three of you very quickly because we've only got about a minute and a half. Tim, what do you reckon?
I think if Europe is forced to choose, they're going to side with the U.S. They will have to accept some losses economically, but their long-term best strategic interest is a close partnership with the U.S.
Theresa?
I think Benjamin Franklin said it best. either we hang together or assuredly we'll all hang separately. So I think the EU and US have to work together along with like-minded partners like Japan, Australia, and South Korea to help create global governance to kind of protect themselves from China's economic coercion.
Who's going to take the heat out of the argument? Who do you reckon, Theresa?
Who will take the heat out of the argument?
Yes.
Well, one point I wanted to pick up earlier, this idea that China is far away and the tensions in the South China Sea is something Europe doesn't need to be concerned about. But we see China coming to Europe. They've invested in ports, and that's a strategic issue for NATO. A lot of these dual-use ports that China has invested in, plus electrical grid. So they're here, the Arctic, exercises with Russia in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic. So China's here, and they have their first overseas bases in Djibouti, and they're about to build another one perhaps on the west coast of Africa.
Very difficult to do without them, and goodness knows, many people wouldn't want to, myself included. Listen, thank you very much indeed. A lot of wonderful Chinese people and businesses out there, despite what we've heard over the last 4 years. Winnie King, thank you very much indeed. Tim, good to see you. Theresa, thank you very much for your expertise, and we appreciate, of course, as ever, the fact that you, wherever you happen to be watching this, have taken the time to do so. We request the pleasure of your company on another occasion. Until then, from me, David Foster, and the Round Table team, goodbye.